Coming up today, crosswires in Washington as the U.S. State Department contradicts the country's intelligence chief on whether denuclearizing North Korea is a lost cause. Lawmakers have decided that one of President Park Geun-hye's close aides should face prosecutors for not showing up as a witness in a corruption probe when summoned by Parliament. First, mixed economic figures. South Korea's consumer sentiment hits a 10-month high, but people's sentiments towards future economic conditions take a turn for the worse. Stay tuned for these stories and more. Hello, it's noon on Wednesday, the 26th of October. You're tuned in to our midday newscast here on Arirang TV. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Mark Broom. Our top story this afternoon, the top intelligence official in the United States says he believes North Korea will never give up its nuclear weapons. His remarks were promptly downplayed by the State Department. It reiterated that Washington's stance is that its current denuclearization policy will eventually have the desired effect. Our foreign affairs correspondent, Gonsuwa, starts us off.
The U.S. State Department has insisted that Washington remains fully dedicated to its policy of denuclearizing the Korean peninsula. It was responding to remarks made on Tuesday by the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, who told the Council on Foreign Relations that denuclearizing North Korea is practically impossible.
I think the notion of getting the North Koreans to denuclearize is probably a lost cause. They are not going to do that. That is their ticket to survival.
The intelligence chief said the U.S. had options to encourage the regime to reduce its stockpile, but it would require some give and take.
Well, the best we could probably hope for is some sort of a cap, but they're not going to do that just because we ask them. There's going to have to be some significant inducements.
Responding to the comments, State Department spokesperson John Kirby made clear that Clapper's views do not represent Washington's official stance. He added that the U.S. is hoping for a resumption of the six-party denuclearization talks once North Korea is able to demonstrate verifiable efforts toward that end. But what exactly constitutes verifiable efforts?
Inspectors have to be able to go into the country and be able to see whether or not North Korea is in keeping with the agreement to denuclearize, should it agree to do so. An example, would be something like what they did in Iran, except in Iran, in the case of Iran, it was a freeze. So in North Korea, it would have to be denuclearization, which is what the State Department has reiterated.
While there are concerns, there is some division within the U.S. on North Korea policy. Some experts say the U.S. intelligence chief's statement should not be taken too seriously, as many things could change because the current administration is on its way out in a few months. Gonsuwa, Arirang News.
Now, the surging price of North Korean coal being exported to China has highlighted the flaws in the international community's sanctions on Pyongyang for its nuclear and missile provocations. And since the coal is used for livelihood-related trade, it doesn't appear the UN Security Council can do much to stop it. Connie Kim reports.
The price of North Korean coal exported to China has surged almost 70%, providing Pyongyang with extra funds for its development of nuclear weapons. Citing China's financial data provider, the Wall Street Journal reported Tuesday that the average price of the North's anthracite coal peaked at $99 a ton in recent weeks from around $59 in August. The report attributed the price surge to China's restrictions of its own coal output this year and heavy rainfall in July. It said Pyongyang and Beijing's coal trade highlights the flaws in efforts to choke off funding for the regime's nuclear weapons program. North Korea was the third largest coal supplier to China last year and exported 2.5 million tons of the fossil fuel to its traditional ally in August, the highest monthly total on record. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry previously pinpointed a livelihood-related loophole in the current sanctions that has allowed the coal trade between the two to flourish.
Greatest amount of coal and the greatest amount of revenue historically has just passed between China and North Korea. And that is hardly putting in place the kinds of sanctions that ought to be in place.
Closing loopholes in the existing sanctions is what the UN Security Council is aiming for. But progress is proving slow as some nations are against it. China's ambassador to the UN reportedly said Beijing was against hurting the well-being of the North Korean people by closing the loophole. Connie Kim, Arirang News.
The United States is planning to release a second blacklist in December of North Korean officials and entities to be sanctioned for their involvement in human rights violations. Scott Busby, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights and Labour, said Tuesday the list will include the names of individuals responsible for human rights abuses in the regime who ought to be sanctioned. He said that with the blacklist, the US seeks to warn North Korean leadership, officials and other human rights violators that their actions are not hidden. The first blacklist was released in July and sanctioned 10 top North Korean officials, including North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, for widespread human rights abuses. Busby also said the US is working closely with other governments to help a strong resolution passed through the UN General Assembly, which will also seek to bring the issue to the International Criminal Court for a third straight year. It has emerged that North Korea's recent failed Musudan missile launch destroyed its mobile launch pad when the missile ignited. A source within the South Korean government says the missile blew up shortly after leaving the launch pad last Thursday. An analysis of the launch by military and intelligence sources has concluded a malfunction in the liquid fuel engine was the cause of the explosion. North Korea has test-fired 8 Musudan missiles since mid-April, and all but one have failed. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has been pushing the military to perfect the Musudan, and many experts believe the regime will attempt another launch in the near future. Lawmakers have decided to ask prosecutors to charge one of President Park Geun-hye's aides for failing to appear at last week's parliamentary audit. The House Steering Committee has asked prosecutors to charge Senior Presidential Secretary Woo Byung-woo with violating the Act on Testimony and Appraisal. Lawmakers summoned Mr. Woo, who is facing a number of corruption allegations surrounding himself and his in-laws, to the audit session on Friday, but he refused to appear. Opposition lawmakers also called for perjury charges to be filed against Presidential Chief of Staff Lee Won-jong. He said during the audit that it would be unthinkable for the president's speeches or other classified presidential documents to be passed to someone who isn't in the presidential office. The person he was referring to was Chae Sun-sil, a former aide to the president who is at the centre of an evolving document scandal. Now, as for the reactions and questions arising after President Park Geun-hye's apology on Tuesday, in which she said she was sorry for seeking advice on her speeches from her longtime aide, Chae Sun-sil, the presidential office said today it had no further comment. At a press briefing, the presidential spokesperson said no follow-up measures are being taken at the moment within the top office, and all allegations and suspicions will be cleared through the prosecution's investigation. Both the ruling and opposition parties have expressed strong criticism of the situation, with some demanding a cabinet reshuffle, resignation from the president's chief aides, and even asking the president to leave the ruling Saenuri party. Meanwhile, carrying out her schedule as planned, President Park Geun-hye sat down with visiting OECD Secretary General Angel Gurria this morning, rating South Korea's role over the past 2 decades since joining the OECD. President Park and Gurria discussed ways to shore up bilateral cooperation as a key member of the OECD. It was their 6th meeting between the two since 2013. On Tuesday, Gurria gave a keynote speech at a seminar in Seoul marking the 20th anniversary of the South's accession to the OECD. He said the organisation appreciates Seoul's role in the international stage for sharing its growth model and its initiative to help other countries achieve similar growth through movements like Semaul Undong. The head of Korea's central bank has called on the government to carry out its ongoing corporate restructuring drive in a consistent manner. His remarks come amid continued concerns over the country's economic growth. Shin Se-min reports.
Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Bank of Korea Governor Lee said, alluding to the country's current economic situation. In a discussion of current economic issues with professors and researchers on Wednesday, Korea's top central banker said the government should carry out its corporate restructuring processes with consistency, especially now when weak demand and oversupply in the global market are hurting the country's key industries. Referring to sectors like shipbuilding and steel, Lee said economic logic should be the backbone of the government's ongoing reform plans, which should also reflect the characteristics of the different industries that are part of the process. On the country's third quarter GDP growth released Tuesday, the governor said the 0.7% on-quarter expansion is a regrettable outcome. He noted, however, that the country had managed to continue its slow growth momentum thanks to the government's policies, despite the difficult conditions at home and abroad. He also acknowledged the continued worries over economic factors that could further impact growth, pointing to the government-initiated corporate restructuring drive, the effects of a new anti-corruption law, and Samsung's decision to permanently discontinue its ill-fated Galaxy Note 7. Adding to the concerns, BOK data showed Wednesday that the public sentiment figure gauging future economic conditions fell to 80 in October from 83 the month before, and the sentiment toward the current conditions remain the same. The BOK governor also promised that the central bank would take an accommodative stance to monitor the uncertainties impacting the economy and said the central bank would work to counteract such uncertainties as they rose. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
Now, a new report by the World Bank has named South Korea the 5th easiest country in the world to do business. The country received high scores for electricity supply, legal settlement, and an easy administrative system for business newcomers. Hwang Ho-jun reports.
One of the top 5 business environments in the world. In its global rankings of business efficiency, which was published by the World Bank on Tuesday, South Korea was ranked 5th out of 190 countries with a score of more than 84 points. The coveted top spot went to New Zealand, followed by Singapore. The average point total for OECD high-income countries was 77.65. South Korea's points total was slightly up from last year and well above the regional average, but still took a step down in rankings. The World Bank's annual report sheds light on how easy or difficult it is for a local entrepreneur to open and run a small to medium-sized business when complying with relevant regulations. It measures and tracks changes in regulations affecting 11 areas in the life cycle of a business, including but not limited to starting a business, getting electricity, resolving insolvency, and labor market regulation. South Korea moved up the rating ladder by finishing first in terms of providing electricity and reaching a legal settlement. The country placed near the top in terms of its environment for starting a business, jumping to 11th place from its previous 23rd. The World Bank especially emphasized Korea's elimination of post-registration procedures. However, the country backtracked on offering protection to minor investors dealing with construction permits and getting credit and administrative procedures on cross-border trading. The nation's finance ministry says it will push to make Korea an even more attractive place for doing business globally and starting new ventures. The government also says it will keep trying to improve regulations in general. Hwang Ho-jun, Arirang News.
A federal judge in the United States has signed off on a massive multi-billion-dollar settlement concerning Volkswagen's diesel car emissions scandal. The move greenlights a massive vehicle buyback in the United States. Ian Shin has the details.
It is one of the largest consumer settlements in U.S. history. A federal judge on Tuesday approved Volkswagen's $14.7 billion settlement for its emissions cheating scandal. Under the agreement, owners of some 475,000 polluting diesel cars in the United States can choose between a buyback or receive modifications to improve emissions and keep their vehicles. Additional cash compensation of up to $10,000 will also be provided, regardless of which option the owner chooses. And the buyback will start as soon as mid-November. The German automaker will also pay $2.7 billion to support environmental programs and invest an additional $2 billion to promote zero-emissions vehicles for the next decade.
This Volkswagen settlement is what we have long waited for. It finally moves Volkswagen closer to closing this very ugly chapter on its history. The consumers have been waiting for Volkswagen to make things right with them, and we're finally at that point.
However, not all Volkswagen drivers in the U.S. are happy. The settlement does not offer a solution for the owners of about 90,000 cars with 3-liter engines that also had the emissions cheating device installed. Volkswagen and the consumers' lawyers are still negotiating a settlement for those vehicles. The world's number 2 automaker admitted in September of last year to installing software in its diesel cars to make exhaust emissions appear cleaner in testings. And while Volkswagen is trying to move past the scandal, some owners may decline the settlement offer and file their own lawsuits against the automaker. 이은신, 아리랑 뉴스.
Well, that's all we have for now. I'm Mark Broom. Thank you, as always, for tuning in. We will be back throughout the day with more newscasts. So until then, goodbye.